Hello and welcome to the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I'm going to discuss the socialist model of development in Vietnam, which many Asian Marxists believe is a model that other socialist countries should emulate. In the previous episode, I discussed China's model of socialism, and it's safe to say that China is seen as the powerhouse of development, regardless of what anyone may think about its claims to be a socialist country. For Westerners, Vietnam barely registers as a socialist country to observe, outside the small number of academics who specialize in Vietnamese society. Recently, I was reading some travelogues online, and quite a few people were shocked to discover whilst they were travelling through Vietnam, they became aware that it is a one-party state, governed, like China, by the Vietnamese Communist Party. Now, I'm not quite sure what to say about that level of ignorance, other than Vietnam's one-party state doesn't seem to bother people who travel there. And why should it? Same can be said for China, Laos and Cuba, although due to the barbaric and cruel sanctions the Americans have imposed on Cuba, that country is suffering badly. What I'm interested in here are the statements made by Professor Pan Jin, a Chinese academic from the Research Institute of Marxism at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who argues that Vietnam's model of socialist development offers, and I quote, a Vietnamese solution to the world socialist movement. Now, by any estimation, that is a profound statement to make coming from a respected Chinese academic. But before I further assess Pan's assertions, the question to pose firstly is how did Vietnam achieve their form of socialism? Vietnam's recent history has been dominated by the war that the Americans inflicted upon the country in the 1960s. A war that little Vietnam won. A war of national liberation that sent the invading Americans packing, and at a great cost to the Vietnamese people and the natural environment. Even though there have been numerous films about the war in Vietnam, which has seeped into popular culture and provided some information, we still, however, can only place Vietnamese socialism in the context of the Vietnamese struggle for liberation and independence, with a reference to American imperialistic warmongering, and the long history of foreign invasion and occupation, beginning with China, who sporadically occupied Vietnam over 1,000 years, and with the French colonial powers, arriving in the mid-19th century, turning the region into French Indochina. During World War II, the Japanese invaded Vietnam, who shared administrative powers on agreement with the French, only for the Japanese to eventually take full control by defeating the French in 1945. Japan then surrendered as World War II came to an end, but the emergence of the Viet Minh in 1941, who had fought against both the French and Japanese, finally defeated the French in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The leader of the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh, became president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, that was North Vietnam, from 1945 to 1969, after the North-South split. The Viet Cong, also known as the National Liberation Front, were the communist guerrilla movement in South Vietnam, and together with the Viet Minh, they created one of the most successful guerrilla movements in history. The Viet Cong were formed in 1960, 19 years later after the Viet Minh and during the war in Vietnam. They formally disbanded in 1976, when all the Vietnamese forces successfully defeated and removed the Americans from their land. This was a humiliation on the grandest of scales for the American imperialist forces. For anyone interested in guerrilla warfare, you should read General Vo Nguyen Zap's book called Big Victory, Great Task, where Zap reflects on the victory against the Americans. General Zap noted that the crucial difference between the war against the French and the Japanese, and then later the Americans, was the use of newly designed technology by the American forces, which fundamentally changed the nature of guerrilla warfare. The Vietnamese forces, therefore, fought a totally different guerrilla war from that of the Viet Minh against the French and Japanese, by adjusting their tactics accordingly against a force that had military and technological superiority. The Vietnamese forces, through direct experience, excelled at the art and science of guerrilla warfare. The military successes are of a great pride of this small country, who have repelled far bigger military powers than themselves, and underscores the present context of Vietnamese socialism. The struggle for liberation and independence is embedded in Vietnamese culture, and it features strongly in Vietnam's constitution. And right from the off, in the preamble to the constitution, it states, and I quote, "In the course of their millennia-old history, the Vietnamese people, working diligently, creatively, and fighting courageously to construct and defend their country, have forged a tradition of patriotism, solidarity, humaneness and righteousness, perseverance and indomitableness, and have created Vietnamese civilization and culture." Now, with regards to the American War, the educational establishments in Vietnam teach school children history under the title of Resistance War Against America to Save the Nation, which is not only about liberation and independence, but crucially for Vietnam, it's also about unification between the North and South. After the Viet Minh defeated the French, the Geneva Accords set out the demands of the split between North and South. This was agreed by the Americans, French and China, and perhaps somewhat surprisingly was agreed to by the Viet Minh. But why would Ho Chi Minh agree to a split in his country? Well, the answer to that is that the Viet Minh's backers, the Soviet Union and China, demanded it. And Ho had been given assurances of a nationwide election in 1956, which never happened because the United States and the newly installed and American-backed South Vietnamese government opposed the election. This was a great act of treachery, and is significant for understanding of the unification in Vietnam today. The preamble to the Constitution also mentions how, and I quote, "the people waged a protracted revolutionary struggle, and how the people suffered hardships and sacrifices for the independence and freedom." It also states that on 2nd of September 1945 that, and I quote, "President Ho Chi Minh announced the Declaration of Independence, founding the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which is now the Socialist Republic of Vietnam." It also speaks about, and I quote, "great victories in national liberation wars and how the nation is moving towards socialism." Now, under Article 4 of the Constitution, it states, and I quote again, "The Communist Party of Vietnam, the vanguard of the Vietnamese working class, simultaneously the vanguard of the toiling people and of the Vietnamese nation, the faithful representative of the interests of the class, the toiling people and the whole nation, acting upon the Marxist-Leninist doctrine and Ho Chi Minh's thought, is the leading force of the state and society." So, I'll pose two questions here. One, what exactly is Ho Chi Minh thought? And two, How does it resonate in modern-day Vietnam in a world dominated by global market forces? The starting point for Ho Chi Minh's thought is based on Marxist-Leninist principles, which is also the case in China, as I discussed in the previous episode. In the Vietnamese online journal Political Theory, there's a fascinating piece titled Ho Chi Minh's Creations in Establishing the Communist Party of Vietnam. Political Theory is a product of the research journal and scientific voice of Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics. Ho was influenced by a quote from Lenin, which can be found in Lenin Complete Works, Volume 4, which is, and I quote, "We do not regard Marx's theory as something fully completed and inviolable. On the contrary, we believe that it has only laid the foundation for a science that the socialists need to further develop in all aspects if they do not want to lag behind life." Now, in other words, Lenin was arguing that Russian characteristics must be taken into account if socialism and then communism was to be achieved. Once again, China today echoes Lenin's thoughts, as in their slogan, "Socialism with Chinese characteristics." Ho then was guided by Lenin, but he wrote about this much earlier than any Chinese communist, and in Ho Chi Minh Complete Works Volume 1, Ho said this in 1924. Marx has built his theory on a certain philosophy of history, but which history? It is European history. And what is Europe? It does not represent the whole human race. We must review Marxism on its historical basis to reinforce it with Oriental ethnology. So, Ho Chi Minh studied Lenin closely, learning the lessons by saying, and I quote, "For a party to be strong, it should be based on a doctrine as the core, and all the members of the party should understand and follow it. A party with no doctrine is like a person who has no intelligence or a ship that lacks a compass. Nowadays, there are many theories and doctrines, but the most genuine, firmest, and most revolutionary doctrine is Leninism." So the Oriental ethnology, or if you like the Vietnamese context, is therefore at the core of Ho's thinking, which he would adapt to the scientific principle of Marxist-Leninism. One important context Ho Chi Minh highlighted was the fact that Vietnam had been invaded and occupied for over 1,000 years. French colonialism had a particular profound impact on Vietnamese culture. French influence within certain layers of Vietnamese society and the reminder of the French through architecture is a part of the Vietnamese memory, which had conflicting feelings within the populace. There was an elite section of society under French rule, such as Vietnamese landlords and urban professionals, such as doctors, architects, teachers, civil servants, etc., who worked directly for the French. French language was spoken by a small but highly significant number of the elite, and French etiquette became a performance art to distinguish the elites from the people. The French-styled opera house in Hanoi showcased performances, sometimes blending French with Vietnamese styles, and of course elements of French cuisine was fused with Vietnamese cuisine. All this had a profound impact on Ho's concerning how the Communist Party sought to unite Vietnam, which was included in the National Salvation Project. In Ho Chi Minh's selected writings 1920 to 1969, there's a short but important piece titled Lenin and the Colonial Peoples, where Ho says, and I quote, "Lenin laid the basis for a new and truly revolutionary era in the colonies. He was the first to denounce resolutely all the prejudices which still persisted in the minds of many European and American revolutionaries. Everyone knows the thesis of the Communist International on the colonial question. The colonial question has been brought to the fore in all congresses of the Communist International, the Trade Union International, and the Communist Youth International. Lenin was the first to realize and assess the full importance of drawing the colonial peoples into the revolutionary movement. He was the first to point out that, without the participation of the colonial peoples, the socialist revolution could not come about. Now, Ho Chi Minh understood that at the time Vietnam's working class was small, and that Marx had argued class consciousness, in part, is a product of the conflict between classes in the dialectical phase of the struggle. Ho therefore adjusted Marxist-Leninism, which was the core or foundational premise, to the character of Vietnam, which, in the 1960s, during the War of National Struggle and Liberation against the American invaders, was overwhelmingly peasant-based. In fact, North Vietnam was 90% peasantry, whilst the South was 82%. The long historical changes which Marx had wrote about in his studies on historical materialism were way off course in Vietnam, which historically has not experienced capitalist development, at least up to that point. Vietnam literally went from a feudal system to a socialist-based system, although, as we will see in a moment, contemporary Vietnam, like China, has embraced a form of capitalist relations of production. The adjustment Ho made to create the Communist Party was to bind class with patriotism, so to cement a unity of what he saw as the two main principal elements of the Vietnamese condition. Now, it's easy with hindsight to be critical of this because, let's be honest, patriotism is a woolly and ill-defined concept, and being unpatriotic in Vietnam today is based on opposition to the vanguard Leninist Communist Party, who has dictated the terms for defining what patriotism means. In sum, this is as unscientific as any Marxist party could get. In fact, it doesn't remotely apply to Marxism. But what else could Ho do, given the historical circumstances Vietnam had undergone at the time? After all, out of the ashes of French colonialism came the destructive, violent forces of the Americans with their napalm bombs, cluster bombs, and much more that devastated both civilians and nature. The online journal Vietnam Briefing has noted the contemporary impact of capitalism on Vietnam, saying, and I quote, "Vietnam aspires to attain upper middle income status by 2030 and to achieve high income country status by 2050. The middle class in Vietnam is expected to expand to 26% of the population by 2026, up from 13%, approximately 13 million people in 2023, creating significant opportunity for businesses." And Vietnam Briefing also says this, and I quote, "While consumer spending remains broadly positive, households are prioritizing essential purchases amid a challenging economic climate, promoting businesses to refine engagement strategies." Now, I don't wish to sound too pedantic, but there are two issues that automatically spring to my mind considering these two statements, which I'll pose as questions. The first is this: isn't socialism meant to reduce, not produce, a class system? And the second is this: what does consumer spending on material products say about Marx's theory of commodity fetishism in the Vietnamese context? In another article for the online journal Political Theory titled Ho Chi Minh's thought on developing the Vietnamese people is the culmination and development of our nation and human values. In that article, the authors Nguyen Thi Kinh Dung and Nguyen Luong Uyen, both from the Ho Chi Minh Institute, discuss Ho's thoughts in relation to, and I quote, developing the Vietnamese people. The authors highlight how people are, and I quote, the most precious asset and the importance of spiritual values in constructing a person's character and dignity. And they also say this, and I quote, notable values include patriotism, national pride, self-reliance, solidarity, compassion, love, charity, compassion for one another, love for one another, value in relationships, love in labour, diligence and hard work, etc. Those spiritual values have been formed over thousands of years of history and struggle to build and defend the country, working, producing, fighting and creating things and values. The authors highlight Confucianism and how morality is central to Vietnamese thinking, and interestingly acknowledge that Marx's concept of alienation is pivotal in understanding what it means to be human. In 1991, the Communist Party of Vietnam detailed the core elements of building a socialist society, stating, and I quote, people shall be liberated from oppression, exploitation, injustice, working based on their ability, gaining benefits based on their labour, having a prosperous, free and happy life, having conditions for comprehensive personal development. Now, the authors of that article detail at the 10th National Party Congress that happened in 2006, how important it was to develop a character for, and I quote, the young generation of Vietnam, and to promote a national cultural identity in the period of industrialization, modernization, and international economic integration. This is an important moment for Vietnamese socialist development because the state is aware of the pitfalls of unfettered capitalist development. So, what economic model exists in Vietnam today? Well, it's called a socialist-oriented market economy and was created at the Communist Party of Vietnam's 6th National Congress in December 1986. Economic forms known as Doi Moi, meaning renovation, were introduced, opening up Vietnam to global trade. In the 1970s, it's worth remembering that Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the world after they came out of the war against the Americans. So the Communist Party moved quickly to make the economic adjustments. In the previous episode concerning the economic model in China, I explained that the Chinese model is called socialist market economy. So how does that differ from Vietnam's socialist-oriented market economy? Well, firstly, both countries are governed by the Marxist-Leninist vanguard model, where the respective communist parties control economic mechanisms and activity. Secondly, whilst the respective states oversee economic production, at the same time there are entrepreneurial freedoms within the market to invest and innovate. And thirdly, both models are transitional towards creating socialism. The difference is that the Vietnamese model, unlike China's, sees the market and therefore capitalist-type production as more temporary, and they claim that it will disappear before full socialism is achieved. The Chinese model, however, sees the market as a continuing functional element for a longer period, but under the strict control of the state's objectives. In relation to Vietnam, this raises key questions in relation also to Marxism and the type of socialism they are seeking to achieve on their way to building a communist society. There's a saying that once the genie is out of the bottle, it's either difficult or impossible to put it back in, and this idiom may apply to Vietnam in the future. For instance, since the reforms of 1986 and the adoption of market forces, albeit controlled, Vietnam has seen a rise in wealth and the subsequent development of a class system. This equally applies to China. According to iNews, Vietnam's gross domestic product, GDP, in 1986 was approximately $4.5 billion US dollars, and in 2024 it was $476.4 billion, about 106 times greater. And they go on to say that Vietnam's per capita in GDP in 1986 was approximately $74 US dollars, while in 2024 it exceeded 4,700 US dollars, about 63 times greater. And they also say this, and I quote, by 2026, Vietnam's middle class is projected to account for 26% of the total population, a significant increase from 13%, approximately 13 million people, in 2023. Any system that creates discrepancies in wealth and income, which in turn creates a class system, bears all the hallmarks of a capitalist-type system. And in Vietnam's and China's case, it currently has all the hallmarks of state capitalism, despite what they say about the movement towards socialism. Creating a classless society from the riches of a class society seems to me to be a daunting task, because will the middle and upper classes give up their wealth and status for the socialist cause in the future? What can't be denied is that Vietnam's progress has been beyond impressive in terms of reducing poverty. In an OECD report titled OECD Economic Surveys, Vietnam 2025, it states, and I quote, Vietnam has almost eradicated extreme poverty over the past decades with the help of sustained economic growth and social protection policies. Extreme poverty, as defined by the World Bank's International Poverty Line, income of less than $2.15 US dollars per day at 2017 purchasing power parities, declined from 45% in 1992 to less than 1% in 2022, one of the lowest poverty rates among peer countries. And the OECD also says this, and I quote, multidimensional poverty has also significantly declined over the past 2 decades, encompassing not only monetary income, but also social dimensions such as employment, nutrition, healthcare insurance, and adult education. And they go on to say, and I quote, multidimensional poverty affected only 4.1% of the population in 2024, according to official figures, highlighting the broad delivery of public services. Now, I think this is a good time to return to the reason I chose to assess Vietnam, which was Professor Pan Jin's claim that Vietnam's model of development offers a Vietnamese solution to the world socialist movement. The near eradication of poverty in just 40 years and Vietnam's economic growth and development is remarkable, considering once again that in the 1970s Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the world, and this has been achieved by implementing the government-led National Target Program on Sustainable Poverty Reduction. Even the World Bank has applauded Vietnam's economic policies, saying, and I quote, Vietnam is a remarkable development success story. Economic reforms since the launch of Doi Moi in 1986, coupled with favourable global trends, helped transform Vietnam from one of the world's poorest countries to a dynamic middle-income economy in a single generation. The transformation over the past 4 decades has brought tangible improvements in people's lives, lifting millions out of poverty, expanding access to healthcare and education, and connecting nearly all households to essential infrastructure. The World Bank also noted how in the early 2000s that Vietnam achieved universal primary education and I quote, its human capital index is the highest among lower middle income countries. In 1993, only 14% of households had electricity, but by 2019, electricity was almost universal. According to a 2021 UNICEF report titled National Strategy on Rural Water Supply and Sanitation by 2030, with a vision to 2045, 51% of rural households had access to clean water, up from 17% in 1993. The Vietnamese government's new national strategy aims to bring that figure up to 100% by 2045. The national strategy also aims to raise Vietnam from a middle-income country to a high-income country. And according to the World Bank, they seek to achieve this by protecting the environment and creating green growth. Indeed, at COP27 in 2022, Vietnam committed to reducing methane emissions by 30% and a complete halt to deforestation by 2030. By 2050, they want to reduce carbon emissions to net zero. In the online news Vietnam Plus, a piece titled Vietnam Makes Great Achievements in All Fields After 80 Years, Chinese expert says. They discuss Pan's comments about Vietnam, where Pan states Vietnam pursues a development for the people. They note how developments in education, healthcare, employment and social security, on top of all the other achievements, has impressed Professor Pan Jin. They detail how, and I quote, education is free from preschool to public high school. Primary school enrollment reached 99.7% in 2024, with a target of 35% university enrollment by 2030. There's also Vietnam's government focus on science, technology and innovation development strategy towards 2030, which aims to raise high-tech industrial products to 45% and foster skilled workforce for future growth. In 1930, at the founding of the Vietnamese Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh presented a document that he had drafted called The First Platform of the Party, Brief Political Platform, Brief Tactics. Ho knew that Vietnam would have to forge their own unique model of development, largely due to the country being dominated by peasants, and his objective was to unite all Vietnamese to create a society that sought to develop a socialist system. And there's a passage in Ho Chi Minh Complete Works that remains a foundation for the present-day Vietnamese thinking in this new phase of development, which is this, and I quote, "The party assembles the mass of peasants to prepare for the land revolution and to overthrow the feudalists and landlords. It liberates workers and farmers from capitalism's yoke. It attracts the petty bourgeoisie, intellectuals and middle peasants towards the proletariat class. It assembles or attracts rich farmers, the bourgeoisie and medium-sized capitalists to defeat counter-revolutionary parties." Now, even though Vietnam has embraced the socialist market-oriented economy model, The party aims to maintain a united country, and presently they have achieved this by reducing the size of income between the middle class and those below. The OECD's report mentioned earlier makes for interesting reading on Vietnam's progress, which says alongside, and I quote, the decline of absolute poverty, income inequality has in general been contained. The OECD go on to state that, and I quote again, in 2023, Vietnam recorded a Gini coefficient of 0.37, reflecting lower income inequality than in peer countries like Malaysia and the Philippines. Now, what is remarkable according to global statistics is that the Gini coefficient in the United States of America is greater. It is 0.494, so it is higher than Vietnam's, meaning income inequality in the US is greater. And according to Forbes, the total wealth of the United States of America, which is the highest in the world, is $163.117 billion. If you have enjoyed this podcast, click like, leave a message, or follow me. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.